Hey everyone, and welcome back. We're diving deep today on some pretty intense global issues. We've got a whole bunch of fascinating sources here. We've got global risk forecasts from the UN. We've got boots on the ground crisis reports, and even a deep dive from RAND on the kind of catastrophic risks that could really shake up the world.
It's a really potent mix of information, I think. We're going to be looking at both immediate crises that are unfolding right now, as well as zooming out to consider the long-term threats that are facing humanity.
Yeah, so it's not just going to be doom and gloom, though.
Right.
We're also going to be looking at how these threats are all interconnected, and most importantly, what can actually be done about them.
That's right.
But first, let's get into this Crisis Watch report that gives us a snapshot of some of the world's most volatile situations right now this month.
Yeah, the report paints a pretty stark picture, highlighting several global hotspots that really demand our attention. Sudan, for example, is facing a brutal conflict between the army and the rapid support forces, and the situation has actually intensified with the army launching new offensives and the RSF being accused of really horrific atrocities.
Wow, it sounds incredibly volatile. What are the potential consequences here if this conflict continues to escalate?
Well, one major concern is the potential for regional spillover. Egypt in particular is watching the situation very closely, and any involvement on their part could really significantly impact the African Union's attempts to mediate a solution.
And then there's Lebanon, which is facing a dire humanitarian crisis amidst this escalating conflict with Israel.
Exactly. The Israeli bombardment and ground incursions have resulted in massive displacement and just real disruption of essential services. The situation is becoming increasingly desperate for a lot of Lebanese citizens.
It's heartbreaking to see these situations unfolding. The Crisis Watch report also highlights post-election violence in Mozambique, with political assassinations really adding to the tension and the potential for some mass demonstrations.
Yeah, and in South Sudan, President Kiir's decision to fire his security chief has raised some serious red flags about potential instability there. It's a really precarious situation that warrants close monitoring, for sure.
So we've got Sudan on the brink, we've got a humanitarian crisis in Lebanon, simmering tensions in Mozambique, and potential political turmoil brewing in South Sudan. That's a lot to take in.
It really is. But these immediate crises, as concerning as they are, also highlight a crucial point, I think, understanding the bigger picture. And that's where the RAND report comes in.
Okay, let's zoom out a bit then and consider these existential threats that are outlined in this RAND report. They identified 6 major threats to civilization: supervolcanoes, asteroids and comets, artificial intelligence, nuclear war, pandemics, and climate change. Now, these might sound like something out of a science fiction movie, but the report emphasizes that they're very real possibilities.
And while some of these threats might feel distant, the report argues that understanding them is absolutely essential for navigating the world today. After all, how we respond to immediate crises like the ones we just discussed is shaped by our awareness of these larger looming threats.
So let's unpack some of these existential threats. First up, we've got supervolcanoes. The report describes how a supervolcanic eruption could lead to global cooling, widespread crop failures, and even societal collapse.
It's not as crazy as it sounds, Think back to the Toba eruption thousands of years ago. That super eruption nearly wiped out our ancestors. And while another eruption on that scale is unlikely in our lifetimes, the report reminds us that is a question of when, not if.
That's a sobering thought. And speaking of potential catastrophes, let's talk about asteroids and comets. It's not exactly a cheerful topic, but we all know what happened to the dinosaurs.
Yeah. The report acknowledges that the likelihood of a major impact in our lifetime is low. But over longer timescales, it's a certainty. What's particularly interesting is their focus on the potential damage. Even a relatively small asteroid could cause...
Right. And our current ability to deflect these threats is still quite limited.
Now let's shift gears to artificial intelligence, a topic that seems to be on everyone's mind these days.
It's not just about the Terminator scenario, although that is a concern that is explored in the report. What's particularly relevant is how AI could amplify existing risks.
Like how? Can you give us an example?
Yeah, imagine AI-powered disinformation campaigns, so sophisticated that they could destabilize governments. Or picture autonomous weapons systems spiraling out of control and triggering a global conflict. These scenarios might sound far-fetched, but they highlight the potential for AI to exacerbate existing tensions and even create entirely new ones.
And this ties in directly with the current information warfare landscape that we're seeing unfold globally. It's a little bit unnerving to think about how AI could play into all of that. Now, let's address the elephant in the room, nuclear war. It's a grim topic, but a necessary one to address, I think. The report underscores that the consequences of a nuclear war wouldn't be limited to the initial blasts. We're talking about the potential for nuclear winter, a scenario that could trigger global famine, economic collapse, and societal disruption on an unimaginable scale.
And when you consider the geopolitical tensions that are highlighted in this UN forecast,
Mm.
it's not hard to see how things could escalate quickly.
Absolutely. Now, shifting gears to pandemics, the report highlights a chilling possibility, the deliberate or accidental release of engineered pathogens.
The next pandemic might not even be natural.
Exactly. With the increasing number of labs handling really dangerous materials, the risk of a lab leak or even a deliberate release is a growing concern.
It's almost terrifying to think about how a microscopic virus could bring the world to a standstill. And then, of course, we have climate change. This isn't some distant threat. This is happening now.
And what's particularly worrying are these tipping points that are outlined in the report. Even seemingly small changes in global temperatures could trigger some irreversible consequences, from rising sea levels to more extreme weather events.
So it's not just about surviving one apocalypse. It's about understanding how all of these threats are interconnected in this complex web of risk. That's a pretty sobering thought.
It absolutely is. The RAND report uses the term polycrisis to describe this phenomenon. It's the idea that these threats aren't isolated. They feed into each other. Climate change, for instance, can lead to resource scarcity, which in turn fuels conflict and instability, potentially increasing the risk of nuclear war or the use of bioweapons.
It's a domino effect. And it's pretty unsettling to consider.
And it's fascinating how these seemingly distant threats are already impacting our lives. Like, take climate change, for example. It's not some abstract future problem. It's having very real effects around the world right now.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And the Crisis Watch report actually highlighted how climate change is exacerbating food shortages in a number of these conflict zones, like Sudan, for instance. The conflict there is already causing massive displacement and hunger. And now climate-related droughts and floods are making the situation even worse.
Yeah, and that scarcity can further fuel conflict and instability, creating this really vicious cycle that can be incredibly difficult to break. It's a stark reminder that these global challenges are really deeply interconnected.
So what does all of this mean for global governance, then? How are countries supposed to deal with these complex, interconnected threats?
Well, it's a question that has a lot of world leaders grappling for answers. The UN, for example, is working to try and find more effective ways to address these challenges.
The report actually mentioned that the UN Security Council is deepening its cooperation with the African Union Peace and Security Council. Is that a sign that they're taking these threats more seriously?
Well, it's certainly a step in the right direction, I think. They've been holding these annual consultations since 2007, and there's been some discussion of even launching joint field missions to address specific crises. However, there's still a lot of debate about how to effectively coordinate responses to these really multifaceted challenges.
It sounds like there's a real need for more proactive preventative measures. Waiting until a crisis reaches kind of a boiling point seems like a recipe for disaster.
I couldn't agree more. The RAND report really emphasizes the need for what they call anticipatory governance, which is essentially about getting ahead of these risks before they spiral out of control.
Okay, that sounds ideal in theory, but
Right.
is it really feasible in this complex world that we live in?
It's definitely a challenge, but it's not impossible, I don't think. It requires a real shift in mindset, though moving away from this reactive crisis management style towards a more proactive, collaborative approach.
So we need better international cooperation, more investment in scientific research, and a willingness to actually address the root causes of these threats. It's a pretty tall order.
It is, but it's absolutely crucial for building a more resilient future. And it's not just about global institutions either. Individual countries have a really vital role to play as well.
Right. Each nation has its own unique kind of vulnerabilities and risk factors.
Right.
And the UN report touched on this particularly in the context of the Asia-Pacific region, highlighting the risk of conflict escalation in the South China Sea, for example.
That's definitely a flashpoint. You've got multiple countries with overlapping claims, and China's growing assertiveness in the region has heightened tensions considerably, and that assertiveness is also leading to increased military spending among China's neighbors, which further increases the risk of an accidental conflict.
It's that classic security dilemma. One country's efforts to bolster its security can actually make the overall situation less stable.
Exactly. And you can see this dynamic in other parts of the world as well. The report also mentioned North Korea's troop deployment to Russia, which is a concerning development for sure.
What's the significance of that, in your view?
Well, it signals this deepening of cooperation between those two countries. And it also raises concerns about North Korea potentially supplying Russia with weapons or technology that could further escalate the conflict in Ukraine. It's a reminder that these interconnected threats are playing out in real time, both globally and within specific regions.
Absolutely. It really underscores the fact that we can't address these challenges in isolation. We need a more holistic, integrated approach.
Precisely. That means breaking down silos between different government agencies, fostering more collaboration between countries, and even engaging with non-state actors like NGOs and the private sector.
That sounds like a massive undertaking. But where do we even begin? What are some concrete steps that individuals and governments can take to start addressing these threats?
That's a great question, and it leads us nicely into the final section of our deep dive today, where we'll explore some potential solutions and strategies for building a more resilient future.
Okay, so we've spent a lot of time, exploring these kind of looming global threats. But it's not all doom and gloom, right? The REND report offers some, potential paths forward, I guess. They outline 3 broad strategies for mitigating these risks: acting, governing, and learning.
Yeah, that's right. So acting focuses on taking concrete steps to either prevent these threats from actually materializing or at least minimize their impact if they do occur.
So what would that look like in practice? Can you
Oh,
give us some examples?
sure. For asteroid impacts, for example, it could involve investing in planetary defense systems, things like telescopes to track potentially hazardous objects, and even spacecraft that could be designed to deflect them. For pandemics, the focus might be more on developing new vaccines and treatments and bolstering public health infrastructure so we can respond to outbreaks more effectively.
And for climate change, I imagine acting would involve things like transitioning to renewable energy sources, investing in carbon capture technologies and stuff like that.
Yeah. Exactly. Now, the second strategy, governing, is all about establishing policies and frameworks to help us manage these risks.
So this is where things like international agreements, regulations, and treaties come into play.
Exactly. Think about, international agreements to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, regulations to guide the safe development of AI, arms control treaties to prevent nuclear proliferation. All these fall under the umbrella of governing.
It's about setting up guardrails, essentially, to help us navigate these complex challenges and hopefully avoid stumbling into disaster. What about that third strategy, learning?
Right. Learning emphasizes the importance of deepening our understanding of these threats through research and analysis. The more we know about them, the better equipped we'll be to manage them effectively.
So that means investing in scientific research, developing better models to try and predict future threats, maybe even running simulations to kind of test out different response strategies.
Absolutely. And it's not just about scientific knowledge either. We also need a deeper understanding of the social, political, and economic factors that contribute to these risks. It's a truly multidisciplinary effort requiring collaboration between experts from all sorts of fields.
It's a tall order, but it sounds like a crucial one if we want to try and create a more resilient future.
Yeah.
And it's not just about governments and institutions either, is it? Individuals have a role to play as well.
Oh, you're absolutely right. Each one of us can make choices that contribute to a more sustainable and resilient future, staying informed, engaging in thoughtful dialogue, and advocating for responsible policies. These are all actions that can make a difference.
That's a powerful message of empowerment. It can be really easy to feel overwhelmed by the scale of these global challenges, but it's important to remember that we do have agency. We can make choices that reduce our vulnerability and contribute to a more positive future.
Indeed. We may not be able to eliminate all risks, but by understanding them, preparing for them, and working together, we can navigate the challenges ahead and create a more secure and sustainable world.
Well said. Well, that brings our deep dive to a close for today. We've covered a lot of ground, from immediate crises to these existential threats. And we even explored some potential strategies for building a more resilient future. It's been quite a journey.
It has.
And on that note, we'd love to hear your thoughts. What resonated with you the most from today's discussion? Share your takeaways and insights with us on social media using the hashtag #TheDeepDive. Until next time, stay informed and stay engaged.